pale winter light drifted over the farthest reaches of the frontier, the kind that seemed to soften every hard memory, yet reveal every hidden bruise. Ada Whitlock walked beside the wagon with her scarf pulled high, breathing in the cold as if it might steady the ache still lingering from the man who had dismissed her so easily. The road stretched ahead in a thin ribbon of frozen dust, carrying her, Susan and Miriam toward a settlement none of them had ever seen, though each pretended it felt familiar. Their boots whispered through the frost, and the world felt suspended between seasons, waiting for some truth to unfold. Susan kept close to the wagon wheel, fingers brushing the wooden spokes as though contact with something solid might keep her thoughts from drifting back to the life she almost settled for. She had once imagined herself married by now, standing in a kitchen warmed by gentle laughter, but the man who courted her wanted obedience more than companionship. His voice still haunted her sometimes, telling her to be quieter, smaller. Winter suited her now, a companion of honest chill that made no demands. Miriam led the small company with the quiet authority of someone who had carried others through storms. She did not speak of her own disappointments, though the winter wind sometimes caught the tension in her shoulders and revealed more than she intended. She had left behind a widower who admired her strength only because he hoped to rest his burdens on it. Strength, she had learned, should be shared, not exploited. So she walked ahead, guiding Ada and Susan with the steady rhythm of someone determined to build a place where none of them had to compromise their worth. The wagon wheel cracked just past midday, a sharp echo across the empty plain. Ada knelt beside it, fingers trembling slightly as she inspected the brake. Her pride stung, because she had been the one insisting they could push through without stopping earlier. Susan crouched beside her, offering a reassuring touch on her arm, while Miriam surveyed the road with narrowed eyes, searching for any hint of help in the stretching silence. Winter wind answered instead, carrying with it a distant rustle that made the three women pause. It was not the wind's voice but something heavier, deliberate, like a footstep pressing into frozen soil. Ada straightened slowly, heart thudding in her ears. Susan's breath trembled, and even Miriam took a careful step toward the sound, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife at her belt. Out of the pale mist stepped a figure, who hardly seemed part of the human world. He moved with the calm certainty of someone shaped by land and sky, a giant silhouette carved from winter stone. As he approached, details sharpened. The broad shoulders bared despite the cold, the long dark hair tied loosely behind him, the strong lines of a face both fierce and peaceful. His chest rose in slow, steady breaths, unfazed by the icy air brushing against his skin. When he stopped a few paces away, the world felt warmer. Ada's thoughts tangled. She had known men who bragged about their strength, men who shouted to prove their worth, men who puffed out their chests like cocks in a yard. Yet this man offered no boast, no swagger, only presence. Susan blinked hard, almost disbelieving the sight, while Miriam instinctively stepped in front of the younger two before catching herself, recognizing that this stranger held no malice. He glanced at the broken wheel, then lifted his gaze to Ada, the movement slow, respectful. He did not speak. Instead, he knelt in the frost, examining the brake with hands large enough to intimidate but gentle in the way they traced the wood. Ada swallowed, unsure whether to move forward or stay still. Something in his calmness held her, not commandingly, but with the quiet gravity of a mountain holding the horizon. The stranger rose and pointed toward a nearby fallen branch, thick and sturdy. Miriam nodded and retrieved it. Susan found rope in the wagon, and together the three women handed him what he needed, their movements synchronized by some unspoken trust forming between them. He set the branch beneath the wagon, muscles flexing beneath winter light, and for a moment Ada forgot the bitterness that had shadowed her journey. She watched him work, every motion deliberate, efficient, almost meditative. When the wheel was braced and secured, he stepped back, brushing frost from his palms. Ada whispered a thank you before she realized she was speaking. He met her eyes, and something in that quiet exchange felt like a shift, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in winter ice revealing the promise of running water beneath. He turned to leave as silently as he had arrived, but paused when a sudden gust swept across the road, whipping Ada's scarf from her shoulders. Instinctively she reached for it, but the wind carried it farther. Before she could react, he strode forward, caught the floating fabric with one hand, and returned it to her with a faint tilt of his head. Not a smile, not quite, but something near it, warm enough to sting. Then he vanished into the mist again, leaving only his footprints pressed deep into the frost. The three women stood in quiet. Susan finally breathed, her voice a thin wisp. "Who was he?" Miriam shook her head, unable to answer. Ada held the scarf close, feeling an unfamiliar heat blooming where cold had lived for months. Far ahead, the road waited for them, but now it felt different. Softer. Warmer. Changed. And Ada sensed, with a shiver she could not name, that the stranger had not simply repaired a wheel. He had shifted the direction of the journey itself, setting into motion something none of them were ready for, but each would feel. Just beyond the mist, unseen, he paused, listening to the winter wind as winter whispered her name. The wagon rolled slowly over the pale winter earth, its newly braced wheel creaking with each turn. Yet no sound felt louder than the memory of the stranger who had emerged from the mist. Ada walked quietly, adjusting the scarf he had retrieved for her, fingertips brushing the threads as if the fabric had stored some warmth from his hands. Susan and Miriam exchanged glances now and then, both trying and failing to dismiss the impression he had left behind. Winter had been a season of endurance until that moment. Now it carried a strange, fragile anticipation. Susan finally broke the silence, her voice soft as drifting snow. "Do you think he lives nearby?" Miriam kept her eyes on the horizon, and answered only with a careful shrug. Ada said nothing. Her heart felt like it was learning a new rhythm, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. She had known men who raised their voices, men who filled every room with their needs and neglect, men who stood tall only when belittling those around them. But the stranger, towering, silent, powerful, held strength the way the mountains held dawn, without effort, without vanity. The contrast unsettled her. As the winter sun climbed, they found a clearing near a half-frozen stream, and Miriam suggested they rest before continuing toward the settlement northward. Susan fed a small fire, coaxing flames from stubborn twigs, while Ada unpacked a tin of dried beans. Though the world around them felt still, Ada sensed a shift beneath the surface, as though something hidden waited to rise, like spring water pressing against winter ice. But the past refused to loosen its grip so easily. When Susan handed Ada a tin cup of warm broth, Ada hesitated before accepting it, remembering how Silas Carter would mock her for needing warmth. Silas, with his golden hair and quick grin, had charmed half the settlement where she once lived. He had spoken to her like she was lucky to be chosen, lucky to be tolerated, lucky he offered her the promise of a future. But when winter arrived early that year and she fell ill for a week, he had vanished to chase easier company. Later, he'd claimed she was too fragile for ranch life, too fragile for him. His words had cut deeper than he knew. Ada sipped the broth slowly. The warmth traveled down her throat, and seemed to unearth memories she wished would stay buried. Susan noticed the flicker in Ada's expression and sat beside her, letting her presence speak more than any consolation. Susan knew disappointment intimately. The preacher's son who courted her last year had insisted she abandon her love of sketching, telling her a wife should focus on prayers, not drawings. He spoke of duty like a cage. The memory made her pulse quicken now, not from longing but relief that she had been spared a life where her soul would wither. Miriam joined them, leaning her back against the wagon. She rarely spoke of the widower she had once nearly married, a man who carried his grief like an anchor, and had wanted her not for companionship but for escape. He had mistaken her strength for a remedy. She had left before his burdens became her chains. The fire crackled softly, wrapping them in a cocoon of warmth. All three women sat together, bound by the quiet understanding that the world had not always been kind, yet each carried a stubborn ember of hope despite the bruises life had offered. Snow began to fall in thin, slow flakes, drifting like pale feathers. The hush that followed was broken by the rhythmic crunch of footsteps approaching from the north. Miriam rose first, hand on her knife, but relaxed when she recognized the man walking toward them. Elias Boone, the storekeeper from the settlement they were approaching, emerged with a sack of supplies slung over one shoulder. He offered a small, sincere smile when he saw them. Elias was the kind of man who moved like a whisper rather than an announcement. He had a gentle steadiness in his gaze that made Miriam straighten, then soften. His coat was worn but neatly stitched, and his boots showed signs of long, thoughtful miles. He greeted the women with a nod, apologizing for the surprise. Word reached town about a wagon heading this way, he explained. He wanted to make sure they weren't stranded by the early winter winds. The women welcomed him to the fire. He sat beside Miriam, leaving just enough space to show respect, but close enough to offer comfort through presence alone. He asked how they were faring, and Susan recounted the broken wheel. When she described the giant stranger who had appeared, Elias's brows lifted with interest. Ada watched his expression carefully. Elias seemed neither threatened nor suspicious. Instead, he listened with quiet contemplation, as if piecing together a story he already sensed had deeper threads. "I believe I've heard of him," he murmured. "There's talk of a man living near the southern canyon. Keeps to himself. Helps travelers sometimes. Never asks for anything in return." Ada's heart gave a small, involuntary flutter. Miriam studied Elias's face, noticing how his eyes softened when he spoke of the stranger's kindness. He was not a man who felt the need to diminish others to feel strong. That alone set him apart from most men she'd known. His presence beside her steadied something inside her she hadn't realized needed steadying. The conversation drifted between soft laughter and quiet reflection. Elias stayed with them through the afternoon, helping tighten the wagon ropes and sharing bread and dried fruit. As the sun dipped low, he offered to guide them partway to the settlement on foot, before returning south to finish his errands. They traveled together until the sky darkened into a pale violet dusk. The road wound through a patch of trees where frost glittered like glass. The women felt safer with Elias near, and yet Ada could not shake the memory of the giant stranger's silent strength. She found her thoughts drifting back to the moment he had handed her the scarf, the warmth lingering in his touch. She wondered what his voice might sound like, whether he spoke with the softness of someone who had learned to listen deeply. A strange, delicate longing rose in her, unexpected, unwelcome, impossible to ignore. Miriam watched her with quiet understanding, but did not speak of it. Susan did the same, sensing a seed taking root. When Elias finally stopped at the fork in the road, he pointed north. "The settlement is just beyond those ridges. You'll see lanterns if the wind stays calm." He wished them luck and touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat before turning back, disappearing into the growing darkness. The night deepened around them. They lit a lantern, its glow stretching long shadows over the snow. Ada's stomach tightened with an emotion she couldn't name, a blend of fear, curiosity, and something tenderer. As they climbed the last ridge before the settlement, a distant sound rose through the winter air. A low rumble, steady and deep. Not thunder. Not wind. Ada stopped walking, her breath curling in the cold. Somewhere behind them, hidden by darkness and trees, a figure moved with the same quiet certainty she remembered from the mist. And though she could not see him, she felt in her bones that the stranger had not crossed their path by accident. Morning crept over the settlement with a hush, as though winter itself wished not to disturb the quiet breaths of those waking beneath its pale sky. Ada stirred beside the wagon, pulling her shawl closer before the cold could claim her warmth. Susan tended a small fire, coaxing reluctant flames from damp kindling, while Miriam organized their supplies with a focus that steadied all 3 of them. Life on the frontier demanded more than endurance. It required a certain tenderness toward each day, a willingness to meet it with open hands rather than clenched fists. Yet beneath these morning rituals lived the memory of the giant stranger, a presence that had woven itself into their thoughts like a thread of smoke refusing to fade. None spoke of it, though each felt the weight of it in her own way. Ada carried the memory closest, tucked like a warm stone in her chest. She kept her gaze on the horizon, pretending to study the sky for weather, but really she listened for the deep, steady cadence of footsteps she had imagined through the trees the night before. The settlement welcomed them with a calm hum of winter life. Children gathered water from a half-frozen well, their laughter rising like startled birds when droplets splashed their boots. A woman swept frost from her porch. A blacksmith hammered quietly, each strike softened by cold air. The women were invited to rest in the communal lodge until they decided whether to settle or continue their journey. They accepted gratefully, grateful for walls that held warmth instead of wind. Days unfolded with gentle rhythm. Miriam took to helping the healer organize herbs and poultices, her strong hands soothing to those in pain. Susan offered sketches to families wanting memories captured, her charcoal strokes revealing tenderness in the smallest details. Ada spent mornings mending clothes, evenings washing linens, and every hour in between battling a restless feeling in her ribs, as though her heart was searching for something unnamed. Their lives began to thread quietly into the settlement's fabric, yet their companionship remained their anchor. Around shared meals they spoke of old dreams, softening their edges with laughter. But sometimes, when the lantern flickered just right, Ada caught Miriam studying her with a thoughtful gaze, the kind that sensed truths before they were spoken. Susan, too, watched her more closely, especially when someone mentioned the southern canyon where few dared wander. One afternoon, while gathering firewood at the forest's edge, they heard the brush of movement behind them. Not the clumsy rustle of an animal. Something larger. Something familiar. Miriam instinctively reached for her knife, while Susan gripped Ada's sleeve. Ada froze, breath held, as the giant stranger stepped from between the pines. Dakota. The name drifted through Ada's mind, though none of them knew it yet. He stood as before, shirtless despite the cold, muscles carved by wind and hardship, dark hair bound loosely behind him. His eyes held depth rather than severity, the kind of calm found in wide rivers and steady dawns. He glanced at their armfuls of wood, then approached with slow, visible respect. Miriam relaxed her hold on the knife, reading his intentions in the ease of his movements. Without speaking, he took part of their burden, stacking the wood effortlessly in his arms. It was not a gesture meant to impress, nor an intrusion. It was simply help offered without expectation. Susan thanked him softly, and he nodded, carrying the load back toward the settlement with them walking at his side. The walk felt longer than it was, stretched by a silence that was not uncomfortable but full, like a page waiting for words. Ada could feel the warmth radiating from him, despite the cold clinging to the world. She sensed Susan's curiosity beside her and Miriam's careful appraisal behind them. As they neared the lodge, Dakota set the wood down neatly, then stepped back. Ada looked up to thank him again, but he had already turned away, disappearing into the trees like a breath returned to the wind. Over the days that followed, he appeared again and again, not predictably, yet always at moments when their paths needed crossing. When the snow threatened to collapse the lean-to, he reinforced the beams with quiet strength. When Susan dropped her sketching charcoal into a stream, he retrieved it with a steady hand. When Miriam pressed her fingers to her temples after a day of tending the ill, he offered her a bundle of herbs that eased the ache. And always, he left without lingering. Ada found herself seeking the sound of his footsteps, though she never admitted it aloud. She watched him from afar sometimes, tracking his movements as he traded furs for flour or water skins for new spearheads. His presence, though imposing, brought calm rather than fear. Yet something deeper stirred beneath that calm, an unspoken connection, impossible to ignore, dangerous to name. One evening, when the sky glowed a quiet lavender and frost clung to the wagon wheels like silver lace, Ada stepped outside to breathe air untouched by the lodge's warmth. She found Dakota standing near the edge of the settlement. He appeared not to have sought her, yet he did not seem surprised she was there. They stood in stillness, two figures carved from dusk. He lifted a stone from the ground, a smooth, rounded piece warmed by the last touch of sunlight, and placed it gently in her palm, closing her fingers around it with a soft pressure. For cold hands, his eyes seemed to say, though no words passed between them. Her breath caught, not from the chill but from the intimacy of the gesture. She opened her mouth to speak, but he had already stepped back, fading into winter's embrace once more. That night, Ada did not sleep easily. Her heart felt like a creature pacing its cage. She wondered what it meant to find comfort in a man who had spoken no words to her, whose kindness was carved into silence rather than speech. Miriam and Susan watched her over breakfast the next morning with the quiet awareness of women who recognized the stirrings of something delicate. As the sun dipped on the third day, the settlement gathered around a communal fire. Stories were exchanged, some playful, some sorrowed. Ada listened, though her attention drifted often to the forest's edge where shadows thickened. Miriam leaned closer, whispering that strength sometimes arrives in silence, and Susan's hand brushed Ada's in gentle reassurance. But the warmth of companionship could not quell the small, persistent fear growing inside her. For every gesture of kindness Takoda offered, he also retreated farther from her reach, as though he battled something unseen. As though the distance between them was not made of steps but of secrets. And as the fire crackled low, Ada realized something with a tremor that rippled through her. No matter how deeply she tried to deny it, her heart had already begun to move toward him. Just before the flames died, a silhouette appeared at the tree's edge, broad, silent, unmistakable, and Ada's breath faltered, knowing winter itself was shifting around her. The silhouette at the forest's edge did not move at first, as though even the shadows were waiting for the fire's last embers to bless the moment with a fragile glow. Ada felt her breath tremble inside her chest, the way a bird trembles before taking flight. Susan, sensing the shift in her, touched her elbow, while Miriam's gaze sharpened with protective instinct. Yet none of them stepped away from the fire, as though drawn by something deeper than fear. When Takoda finally emerged, he moved with the same quiet certainty that had become familiar, yet something in the angle of his shoulders suggested strain. His steps were deliberate but heavy, as though he carried the weight of a truth he had not meant to bring into the night. He paused a few paces from them, the firelight catching the strong lines of his face, casting bronze warmth across his skin. His eyes flicked briefly to Ada, and she felt her heart fold into itself. But then another sound rippled across the clearing, bootsteps, sharp and unhesitating. Ada stiffened, recognizing the cadence even before the man stepped into view. Silas Carter emerged from the darkness with a grin that carried no warmth, only the polished charm he wore like a badge. His coat hung open, snowflakes settling on his shoulders as if even winter hesitated to touch him. "Well, well," he drawled, though the words were unnecessary. His presence alone was enough to tilt the air. Miriam rose immediately, coming to stand beside Ada. Susan followed, her chin tight with quiet anger. Takoda said nothing, but his stance shifted, a subtle protective pivot that placed him between Silas and the fire. Silas's gaze slid over the three women before landing on Ada with the familiarity of a man who believed he still held claim. "Didn't expect to see you this far north," he said, as though his voice could still coax obedience. Ada kept her silence, unwilling to offer him even a scrap of acknowledgement. His eyes moved to Takoda next, measuring, mocking. "And this must be the giant you three have been chattering about. Quite the sight, isn't he?" He chuckled, but the sound was brittle. "You choosing a man of few words now, Ada? Or have your standards fallen even lower?" The cruelty struck like a blade she once would have felt deeply, but something inside her had changed. Winter had carved new strength into her bones. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft but unwavering. "Leave us be, Silas." Silas blinked, not used to such quiet refusal. His jaw twitched, and for a moment the facade faltered, revealing the insecurity simmering beneath. "You think he'll protect you?" he sneered, nodding toward Takoda. "These wild men, no loyalty, no law. They take what they want." Takoda stepped forward then, not aggressively, but with a calm so profound it silenced even the fire's crackle. He did not touch Silas, did not threaten him. His presence alone, unyielding, steady, was enough to force Silas a step back. Takoda's gaze held no malice, only a truth Silas could not comprehend. Strength without cruelty. Silas spat a curse, then turned sharply, retreating into the night with anger snapping at his heels. His departure left the clearing strangely open, the quiet thick with the breath that no one had realized they were holding. Ada exhaled slowly, her knees weakened not by fear, but by the emotional weight that had settled inside her. Miriam placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Susan stood close, her presence a shield of gentle solidarity. The fire brightened briefly, as if relieved to witness such truth. Takoda's gaze returned to Ada, and in the dim light she saw a flicker of something heavy, something he had carried long before tonight. She stepped toward him without thinking, compelled by instinct more than intention. His voice, when it came, was low and rough like river stones stirred by current. "You should not fear that man." Ada shook her head. "I don't," she whispered, and it felt true in a way it never had before. But something else rose in her chest, a fear not of Silas, but of herself. Of the feelings unfolding too quickly, too deeply. She had been bruised before by choosing wrong, by trusting a voice that promised warmth but delivered cold. Now she stood before a man whose kindness was carved in silence, whose strength was a shelter rather than a threat. And that unfamiliar safety frightened her more than Silas ever could. Dakota seemed to sense the conflict rippling through her. He stepped back slightly, creating space. His expression held a sorrow so soft she felt it rather than saw it. "I bring danger," he murmured, "more to the night than to her. My world is not yours. It is better if I keep distance." The words struck her like sudden frost. She opened her mouth to protest, but emotion tangled her tongue. Miriam's eyes widened with recognition of the truth beneath his retreat. Susan watched with quiet ache. "You think you know what is better for me?" Ada asked finally, her voice barely more than a breath. Dakota's gaze met hers then, and she saw the struggle warring inside him. He had lived between worlds, belonging fully to none, burdened by histories and expectations Ada could not yet name. His silence was not rejection, it was fear of consequence. "I think," he began, but the sentence broke. He turned toward the treeline, ready to vanish as he always did, slipping back into solitude before connection could root itself. Ada felt her heart clench. Not because he walked away, but because she recognized the shape of his fear. It matched the one inside her. Two hearts, both afraid of wanting. Before he disappeared into the shadows, he paused. The firelight grazed his profile, outlining the strength carved into him by wind, hardship, and loneliness. Ada watched his shoulders rise with a breath that seemed to carry years of quiet battles. When he finally spoke again, his voice was soft enough that only she heard. "I am not a man who should stay." The words pierced deeper than Silas's cruelty ever had. Dakota stepped into the darkness, leaving the fire's glow behind, leaving Ada standing at its edge with her pulse trembling like a lantern flame in wind. She did not follow, not because she lacked will, but because she sensed the moment demanded stillness. Yet even as he vanished, she felt something shift. The distance he insisted upon was not built of indifference, but of sacrifice. And that truth, with its raw, aching tenderness, lit a fear inside her more potent than any danger. For the first time, she feared losing something she had not yet been brave enough to claim. Dawn crept into the world like a breath held too long, soft and trembling, brushing pale gold across the settlement rooftops. Frost clung to every surface in delicate filigree, as though winter wished to preserve the last fleeting hours of silence before truth changed everything. Ada stepped outside with her shawl gathered close, the cold morning settling around her like a question she no longer knew how to answer. Sleep had eluded her. Her thoughts had moved through the night like restless shadows, circling the hollow left by Dakota's retreat. Miriam and Susan watched her from the lodge doorway, worry threading their features, but they did not call her back. Something in Ada's posture, the stillness, the yearning, told them she walked a path only she could face. Her breath drifted in thin clouds, disappearing into a sky pale as memory. She paused near the edge of the settlement, listening for the familiar cadence of footsteps she had come to recognize even in dreams. But only wind responded. It carried the faint scent of pine and distant river, and beneath it, something else. Something she had come to understand not by sound but by presence. She turned slowly, heart tightening as a figure emerged from the frost-laden trees. Dakota walked toward her with the steady, heavy steps of a man facing his own truth. He still wore no shirt despite the biting cold, and his breath rose in soft plumes that vanished almost as quickly as they formed. But his eyes, dark, quiet, full of restrained storms, held a vulnerability she had not seen before. It softened him. It steadied her. He stopped a few paces away, uncertainty flickering across his expression, like a shadow cast by shifting firelight. Ada's fingers curled into her shawl, gathering courage from its worn threads. She took one small step toward him. He looked as though he wanted to step back, yet something kept him rooted. Perhaps fear, perhaps longing, perhaps both. "You left without a word," she said softly, her voice fragile at the edges but unwavering. The words floated between them, thin as frost yet sharp enough to pierce. Dakota lowered his gaze. "I did not wish to bring trouble to your path. Trouble finds me with or without you," she whispered, the truth startling even herself. The ghost of Silas still lingered somewhere in the world, but his shadow no longer claimed her attention. What mattered was the man before her, the one who had steadied wagon wheels and frightened hearts without ever raising his voice. Dakota's jaw tensed. My world is not gentle. Nor simple. I keep distance so others do not carry what I carry. Ada stepped closer, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots. And do you think I am so fragile that kindness must avoid me? His head lifted then, surprise flickering in his eyes. Not fragile, he murmured. Never fragile. But you deserve a life without fear. A breath of wind swept between them, stirring Ada's hair. She reached out with trembling fingers, though she did not touch him yet. Then stay close, she whispered. Because I am more afraid of losing you than anything else. The words broke something open in the morning stillness. Dakota inhaled sharply, and for the first time Ada saw fear in him, not of danger but of desire. Of hope. He took a step toward her, closing half the distance that had weighed on them for days. When he spoke, his voice was rough, dragged from the deepest part of him. I have walked many winters alone, he said slowly. The cold has never frightened me. But the thought of caring for you, of failing you, terrifies me. Ada's breath trembled. Then let it terrify you. Let it terrify both of us. But don't walk away from me anymore. Dakota's hands curled into fists at his sides, as though fighting the instinct to reach for her. He stared at the ground, then at the sky, then finally at her, a long searching look that stripped away every barrier he'd tried to build. When he spoke again, his voice cracked with a truth too heavy to hold any longer. I tried to stay away, he whispered. I tried to silence what I feel. But every step I take from you leads me back to the same truth. Ada's pulse hammered. Tell me, she breathed. Dakota stepped forward until only a breath separated them. His voice turned to a low, trembling confession. I love you, Ada. From the first moment I saw you standing in the frost, I loved you with a depth I feared would swallow us both. I kept silence because I did not believe I deserved what your eyes offered. But I cannot hold silence anymore. I am yours if you will have me. Heart, strength, all I am. The world seemed to exhale. Ada's eyes burned with tears she hadn't meant to shed. She reached for his hand, touching his skin for the first time, warm despite the cold. His fingers curled around hers instinctively, reverently, as though her hand was something sacred. I want a man who listens, she whispered. Who protects without owning. Who loves without taking. And you are all of that. Dakota lifted his other hand to her cheek, brushing away a tear with the gentleness of falling snow. The tension in his shoulders loosened, and emotion softened the strong lines of his face. When he bent his forehead to hers, the winter morning felt like spring waiting to bloom. I will never walk away again, he murmured. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing then, carrying with it the warning rumble of distant hoofbeats. Ada stiffened. Dakota's arm slid around her, guiding her behind him instinctively. Silas emerged from the ridge with rage carved across his features, riding hard toward them. His voice cracked through the cold like a whip. That Apache bastard doesn't touch what's mine. Dakota's muscles tensed, but he did not step forward. Instead, he glanced back at Ada, and the calm in his eyes steadied her heart even as fear churned. Stand behind me, he whispered, not out of dominance but devotion. Silas dismounted in a fury, hand reaching for the rifle strapped to his saddle. But before steel met hand, Miriam and Susan appeared from the settlement trail, their voices rising in warning. Doors swung open. People stepped out. Elias approached with measured purpose, jaw set. Silas froze, realizing too late that he stood alone. Dakota took one step toward him, not with violence, but with a silent strength that drained every ounce of bravado from Silas's posture. In that moment, Silas understood exactly who Ada had chosen, and who he could never be. He retreated slowly, mount trembling beneath him, then turned and rode away without another word. Silence settled again, but now it glowed warm as embers. Dakota turned back to Ada, lifting her hand to his chest. Feel this, he murmured. My heart beats with your name. Ada rose on her toes and kissed him, slow and certain, as dawn broke fully across the sky, spilling gold over the winter world that had brought them together. Their story had only begun.